Here we're going to go through a second trading example, and then this time we're going to look at what would be acceptable by both and mutually beneficial by both trading terms that we could have in terms of cars and wheat. So to start off here, as we mentioned before, we're going to try to find who has comparative advantage in producing cars or wheat. And because we know that as soon as one has comparative advantage in producing cars, it means that the other one has comparative advantage in producing wheat. We could then start figuring out, if we're pretty confident with our answers, the terms of trade relatively quickly. And this is the kind of problem that if you're hesitant, you should verify by doing it the other way and verify that your answers are still the same. So here I'm going to look at who has comparative advantage in producing cars. So here, as I mentioned before, Canada could either produce 20 cars or 100 wheat. 20 cars or 100 wheat, which means that on a per car basis, one car means it gives up 5 units of wheat. This is for Canada. And if we look at for Japan, well, Japan could produce 60 cars at the same amount of time as 80 units of wheat. Therefore, for one car, it gives up 8/6 or 4/3 unit of wheat. 4/3 is much smaller than 5 units of wheat. Therefore, Japan has comparative advantage in producing cars. It has a lower opportunity cost. In this case here, I fast-tracked this process and I didn't look at the concept of absolute advantage, because under the concept of absolute advantage, it's not really relevant to tell us what would be the acceptable terms of trade. It's a useful concept, but it doesn't tell us nearly as much as comparative advantage can in terms of who should produce what and so on and so forth. However, if I look at this, if I look in terms of cars, while Japan can produce more cars than Canada has absolute advantage in producing cars, whereas Canada has the absolute advantage in producing wheat because it could produce more wheat than Japan. So in this case here, we no longer have an example where one country or one producer has absolute advantage in both, but actually they both have absolute advantage in one of the two goods. In this specific case, another hint that you could think of is, in this specific case, whatever you have absolute advantage in, you will have comparative advantage in as well. It wouldn't be possible for Japan to have absolute advantage in producing cars and not absolute advantage in producing wheat, as we have here, and then being comparative advantage in producing wheat. So here it makes sense to say that Japan has comparative advantage in producing cars because it also has absolute advantage in producing cars. So it's an easy way to verify that this answer here makes sense. So I verified that it makes sense. So now let's try to see what are the terms of trade that are possible. So to see this, I always like to draw out a little timeline. And I'll draw this out here. And this timeline will go from 0 to infinity. So from 0 to infinity. And this, I'll say 0 to infinity, is the number of wheat per car. Okay? It could have been the number of car per wheat, but I like it to have it as the number of wheat per car because in this calculation here, we've looked at this idea of only one car, and we've seen the opportunity cost to trade off in terms of wheat. So it's already in that right format that I'm interested in the amount of wheat, because the number of cars has been standardized in both examples. So number of wheat per car. So if I think about here, who's producing what? Well, Japan has a comparative advantage in producing cars, therefore Japan is producing cars. Japan wants to trade with Canada and wants to obtain wheat. Ideally, where would Japan have this trade be? Would it be that it receives practically no wheat for a car, or is it that it receives an infinite amount of wheat per car, Well, obviously over here, Japan would be happier. Therefore, we have a certain threshold point where they accept, but the further we are to this very large amount of wheat per car, the happier Japan will be. Well, what is that threshold amount of wheat that Japan has to obtain to be willing to trade a car for the wheat? Well, that threshold actually is linked to its opportunity cost. If Japan decides to produce wheat on its own and decides to give up the production of one car, it will obtain 4/3 unit of wheat. So here 4/3. Therefore, if it gets 2 units of wheat per car instead of 4/3, which is a larger amount of wheat, it will be happier. But if you were to give Japan only half a unit of wheat per car, it would say, no, I'm not interested, because if I choose not to trade you this car, but actually choose to not produce it myself and produce wheat instead, I will obtain 4/3 units of wheat here. So 4/3 for the people who don't like fractions is 1.33. This is the amount of units of wheat that Japan would obtain by producing it on itself in exchange for a car. So anything between this threshold point to the right, Japan would accept. Okay. At 4/3, you could think it accepts. It's not really happy. It's not gaining anything. But if you give it anything above 1.3333, it will accept. So if you give Japan 1.35 units of wheat per car, or 1.5 or 2, it's benefiting. It might not be benefiting a lot, but it's benefiting. Now looking at Canada. Well, Canada is the one that's producing the wheat and getting cars instead. So ideally, where does Canada want to be? Does it want to give up no wheat to obtain a car, or an infinite amount of wheat to obtain a car? Well, actually, because it's giving up the wheat, it wants to give up the least amount of wheat possible to get a car. And if you were to ask Canada to give up 1,000 units of wheat per car, it would say, no, not interested. And once again, this refers to its opportunity costs. So if I say 1,000 units of wheat for one car, I would say, no, if I choose to produce my car myself, I only have to give up 5 units of wheat. Therefore, 5 is the maximum that Canada is willing to give up. You ask it to give 6 units of wheat, it will not be interested, because internally it could do better. So 5 or less, Canada accepts. If Canada could only give up 1 unit of wheat to obtain a car, it would be super happy. Because per 5 units of wheat that it used to give up to get 1 car, they would obtain 5 cars. So anything along this line here, Canada accepts. At the limit, it's not really gaining anything, as was Japan. So you could think then that this whole trading agreements, so giving up, let's say, 2 wheat per car, giving up 3 wheats per car, 4 wheats per car, are all acceptable by both. Both are gaining anything in this range here. So this is my terms of trade limits, or range that I would call it. So this whole range here is my range, and these points here are my limit points, because I cannot go beyond one side or the other, because even though over here Japan would accept, Canada wouldn't accept, and over here, even though Canada would accept, Japan wouldn't. And here we're not allowed to use weapons or bullying of some form to getting the other person to accept. Here we're interested in areas where both parties would be happy. Okay, so if we had a question along these lines in an exam, you would have to mention who has comparative advantage in what, who produces what, and then afterwards if you say Japan produces this, Canada produces that, what would be the range of acceptable terms of trade, which would be this whole range from 4/3 to 5 units of wheat per car. And then if I were to ask what would be a trading level that would be acceptable by both, and both would actually be gaining, well, you could say 3 units of wheat per car would be acceptable by both, and both would gain from such a trade. I will prove this in a second here, but this would be the situation. The last little point here I'd like to highlight is that this is a big range. And this big range, if you're in the middle, both are gaining pretty evenly. But if you're on one side or the other, you may have a situation that one gains more than the other. So if this were a much stronger, much bigger company and company or country, and a much smaller and less present company in the other case, you could think that one of the two might have stronger bargaining power. So if in this case here, let's just say for practical reasons, just as practice, that Japan had way more bargaining power, well, you could imagine that this is its acceptable limit. It would try to negotiate for something that will get it more gain, more bang for its buck. So if it can negotiate to getting 4.5 units of wheat per car, both are accepting it's within this acceptable range, but Canada just gains a little bit, whereas Japan gains a lot from this trade. So this is something that can happen potentially with countries with different levels of bargaining power. However, as I mentioned before, if you stay within this range, it is mutually beneficial for both countries.